Skarner's rework feels like yesterday, and what a terrifyingly ambitious overhaul it was, with not a single crystal remaining. A once bright and colourful creature had been turned to an infinitely grey mass of rock. At least, that's what many feared would happen, but perhaps not everyone. Was the new Skarner rework unnecessary and unjust, or did it successfully revive the last of its kind? While to find the answer to these questions, we will need to look at Skarner before his rework. What we need first is a quick summary of where he is now, and where the rework has placed our Scorpion. The current Skarner is a tank, primarily playing from the jungle. His passive applies a 4-second poison for a percentage of their max health in magic damage when Skarner strikes him with attacks or his Q or R. His Q ability first nerfs a boulder to gain attack and range buffs for free autos, with the third, or the recast of the ability, hurling the boulder either at the attacked target or a chosen direction for high physical damage with bonus max health scaling, then slowing them for 1 second as well. Skarner's W emits a wave that deals damage and slows anyone hit by it while shielding himself for a percentage of his own maximum health. The E ability charges, even through terrain, at a set speed, steerable with your cursor, and catches and suppresses the first champion or large monster Skarner collides with, then can slam them into a wall for damage and a stun. Finally, Skarner's ultimate, after a brief cast time, suppresses up to 3 enemy champions in front of him, and Skarner can drag them freely for 1.5 seconds. This Skarner mostly plays tank, with the majority of builds taking quick heart steals and other pure tank items, with near enough no damage items in sight, relying purely on Skarner's utility on his charge and ultimate, as well as his easily applicable maximum health damage. With us all up to speed, it's time to dive back to how Skarner was before his rework. Skarner was released in August of 2011, dating all the way back to Season 1. He was introduced in the Champion Spotlight as a fighter, a jungler, and true hybrid. Skarner's damage was mixed, with both physical and magical damage available, and even both AD and AP ratios. This was more commonplace in early League of Legends, where AD often mostly referred to auto-attack damage, and your abilities were enhanced with ability power. For his abilities, Skarner's passive was Energize, and would reduce all of Skarner's ability cooldowns by 0.5 seconds with every auto-attack. Against champions, the reduction would be doubled to 1 second. This went kinda crazy with Crystal Slash, Skarner's Q. It dealt instant damage in a small area around Skarner when cast, and if it hit an enemy, Skarner would charge himself with energy, empowering further crystal slashes with bonus magic damage and a slow. The fun part of this ability wasn't its damage, it doing hybrid damage, nothing like that. It had a very short cooldown of about 3.5 seconds. Since Skarner could get this old stat called cooldown reduction, reducing the CD of abilities by up to a maximum of 40%, this could get his Q's cooldown as low as 2.1 seconds. And a piece of information I haven't mentioned yet is that Skarner's Q slow lasted for 2 seconds. Either with cooldown reduction or without it, Skarner's passive reducing his Q cooldown by 1 second per auto attack also meant it was abysmally easy to slow someone for as long as you could stick to them. If there was no one around to stun you or they couldn't flash or dash away, there was no escape. But that was just his passive and his Q. Skarner's W then was Crystalline Exoskeleton, which granted Skarner a shield, and in turn, that shield granted Skarner movement speed and attack speed while it held. This gave great movement, durability, and aided clear and gank speed greatly. Skarner's E was Fracture, blasting with a linear skill shot to mark enemies. If Skarner dealt damage to the marks, he would consume them to heal himself. His ultimate was Impale, which, with a simple melee range click, would suppress the targeted champion. While suppressing them, Skarner could move freely to drag the target, following his movements. It also dealt damage at the start and end of the cast. This Skarner was defined by being very fast, sticky, and by his ability to control the battlefield. His Q had AD and AP ratios, allowing for excellent use of Trinity Force, which at the time granted a triad of attack damage, ability power, and attack speed. Even though his other 3 abilities sported AP ratios, including the shield, AP Bruiser itemization wasn't quite the same as it is today, and Rylai's Crystal Scepter was redundant on Skarner. So AP Skarner would mostly be a meme. Typically, Skarner could either opt for full tank, which relied on his utility and ultimate, zooming in to steal a carry from its team's clutches with a death charge and an impale, or a more bruiser-like build for a bit of damage, abusing the low cooldown of Skarner's Q, together with his passive, for rapid application of Trinity Force's Sheen procs. At this moment, I would like to draw comparisons between the old Crystal Skarner and the newly reworked Skarner, contrasting them but also showing where ideas may have been transferred and inspired between the two Skarners. But there is a slight problem with this. There weren't just two Skarners. This old iteration of Skarner lasted until patch 4.2, so roughly about 3 years. The changes at this point were mild, mostly moving around parts of abilities. The slow of Skarner's empowered Crystal Slash would be moved to Skarner's Fracture skill shot, no longer marking them for potential healing. The Exoskeleton's attack speed was moved too, now granting a stack of increased attack speed for hitting opponents with Q, up to 3 stacks. Though hardly a rework, it was Skarner's most significant changes since his release, and quite literally reworked aspects of his kit. If you were playing back then but didn't remember this small set of changes, then that's understandable, because I didn't remember them either. But what was a rework, the first of many, would arrive only 8 patches later on patch 4.10. While at a glance he seems very similar, let's dive into what the abilities did at that time. His Energize passive was entirely replaced with Crystallizing Sting, which had Skarner's ability to apply stacks of Crystal Venom to large monsters and enemy champions. Once an enemy had the max of 3 stacks of Venom, Skarner could basic attack them to consume the marks for bonus magic damage and to stun the target for between 0.5 to 1 second, depending on Skarner's level. Once stunned, the same target could not be stunned again for a little while, kinda like Udyr's bear stand. Ornn sense. I always remembered this being in exchange for the Q permaslow, but as we just went over 8 patches prior, the slow was always moved to and remains on his E. Skarner's Q did take a big rework though, as it stole his old Energize passive for itself, reducing its own cooldown when Skarner lands basic attacks. Hitting the Q would now grant movement speed as well as attack speed. They also buffed his ultimate's damage, dealing bonus damage for each Venom stack on the target, rewarding Skarners who were patient and calculating enough to ult for damage instead of a longer CC chain with the Q stun, and Skarner's W had its cooldown reduced. By this point, Skarner effectively had his Q changed from permanent slowing to now providing permanent speed, maintaining that identity of being sticky and hard to get rid of. Giving harder crowd control with the new stun gave him more utility, but more satisfying for both sides. First I'm sure you've guessed by now, Skarner's reworks did not end with this. Patch 5.16 was one of the patches of all time, otherwise known as the Juggernaut update. Although there already existed classes like Fighter, which dealt good damage, often up close, while maintaining decent defense, Tank, which didn't often deal great damage but had excellent defense and utility, and Carry, which had next to no defense but fantastic damage, Riot decided to create a new class known as the Juggernaut, and picked 4 simultaneously lucky and unlucky champions to undergo the change. Garen became a vicious murderer and would brand one particular enemy as the villain, deciding to commit true damage against them. Darius had his instant Q replaced with a deadly but slow Q, as well as many other changes which are actually still around today. Mordekaiser could steal the ghost of the dragon, and Riot decided it'd be kinda cool if he could go bot lane, so he just kinda got more experience in duo lanes. And the fourth, of course, was Skarner. Skarner's Juggernaut rework was similar in scale to other Juggernauts, and similarly unique for League at the time. The largest change was his new passive called Crystal Spires. Instead of gaining attack and movement speed by hitting Qs, he gained it and percentage maximum mana regeneration through standing in a captured Crystal Spire zone. These spires would only spawn if Skarner was in the game and could be captured by standing on them by either team. Doing so would grant some gold, either 15 to a solo capture or 30 gold split amongst multiple, and would grant only Skarner the aforementioned Spire buffs. His new Q was largely the same, with adjusted AD ratios and cooldowns to be stronger in the late game, and lowering his non-champion cooldown reduction to balance it with his new Spires. But as mentioned, its attack speed and movement speed buffs were fully transferred to the Spires. Skarner's W was mostly the same, but now provided a shield entirely based on Skarner's maximum health rather than a flat value. Fracture, Skarner's E, was changed to now apply Crystal Venom. No longer did Skarner's Venom need 3 stacks, but just to be applied by a linear skill shot. Once done, Skarner's next attack would consume the mark to stun them for 1 second and some physical bonus damage. At the time of this rework, the projectile would get slower for every enemy it passed through and could hit a maximum of 6 targets. His ultimate was mostly the same, but no longer did bonus damage to enemies with Venom. It was also given a 100% AD ratio as the Juggernauts were largely AD, with even Mordekaiser having AD options given to him. And if an enemy was stunned or suppressed by Skarner's Venom Mark or Impale, Skarner would get the bonuses of the Crystal Spire even if he wasn't next to one. This allowed faster wave clear by chaining autos on targets marked by your E, but mostly just gave bonus movement speed while stunning or impaling enemies. This was certainly a rework. The Juggernauts aimed to be unique in new ways compared to other classes at the time. Though bruisers or fighters had both good defense and offense, and could sport mobility and some utility in their kits, they would not excel as much as tanks or carries in either regard. Carries had low base damage but scaled excellently with items through steroids or ability ratios, and tanks had decent base damage but much worse damage scalings. Juggernauts sought to have both high scalings through ability ratios and high base damage in their stats and kit. They even had good defense like a tank through those base stats, and health scalings in their defensive abilities like Darius' Q heal and Skarner's exoskeleton shield. This was in exchange for something that other classes often had, but Juggernauts could not have: mobility. Though they may have limited utility like Darius' E-pull, and some movement speed like Garen's Q, they traded decent crowd control and mobility in exchange for having high damage and tankiness from early game all the way to late game. So movement speed items were great recommends like Trinity Force and Deadman's Place, which was added one patch prior. This puts Skarner in a weird position, because he doesn't quite fit this mold like the other Juggernauts. This led some, including even Riot down the line, to no longer consider Skarner as a Juggernaut, but just a weird tank. True enough, the most consistent builds for Skarner all the way through to his next rework were often full tank and utility, often with movement speed like Deadman's Plate, but I think I see where the original designer for Juggernaut Skarner was going with this. Juggernaut Skarner's early damage was actually bad. Even with a Crystal Spire, his dueling potential was not actually great. Not only did he not have that, but he also had much more crowd control than the other Juggernauts. Now, if he didn't have damage and did have crowd control, that would make him a tank. But from my perspective, having played him and even just looking at the kit now, he was a unique type of Juggernaut. One I would lovingly view as a potential late game hyper carry. Now, stay with me now, let me cook. He's not here anymore, so I can't ruin your game with Juggernaut Skarner builds, can I? You aren't going to use this on new Skarner, are you? The Crystal Spire buff would scale with Skarner's level. Yes, it gave 100 bonus movement speed throughout the game, but it gave anywhere between 48 and 160% bonus attack speed to Skarner. Though initially this just helped Skarner clear out his jungle, this made late game Skarner Spires an absolute no-go zone. If you fight late game Skarner in his zone, you die. The high attack speed facilitated extreme spam of his 2.5 second Q that reduced by 1 whole second for every auto attack against champions, and with cooldowns that low and the right build, he didn't even need Spires to be deadly. So yes, he had CC, he had high attack speed, but surely that's not the only way he scaled, right? Quite correct. I think that Juggernaut Skarner was intended to scale by giving him the one thing in late game that Juggernauts couldn't have: mobility. While Spire movement speed was great, as the game went on, Skarner could put more ability points into his W, granting him even more movement speed on a low enough cooldown to have the shield and speed up permanently. Though he couldn't dash, flash aside, this made him a very fast, low cooldown, rip and tear, AoE Q spamming Juggernaut with crowd control options on his stun and targeted suppressions, who was also naturally tanky with high base stats including high base AD, and could absolutely 1v1 even the likes of Master Yi with relative ease. He just needed to be carried through the early game to reach that point by his Crystal Spires. Though it's clear in both his Juggernaut update and the previous Season 4 update that Riot wanted Skarner to stop being full tank and start dishing out some damage, we both know Skarner players would go straight back to going full tank. Though the damage with Trinity was absurd, players would prefer the tankier Iceborne Gauntlet, also providing slows kinda like his old perma-slow incarnation. He was considered decently weak, and his main appeal, singling out a target carry with his ultimate, had been done better by other champions since his initial release, such as Vi and even Nautilus. But though Impale was still an attractive option, Riot would try and buff Skarner since the Juggernaut rework, buffing his E stun duration all the way up to 1.5 seconds, increasing his damage, increasing the Spire radius, increasing his base stats, and so on. But it seemed that the Juggernaut dream was dying, and it was apparently time Riot accepted it. Another significant pack of changes would arrive on patch 10.15, reducing the AD ratio of Skarner's Q from 33 to 45% of his AD, all the way down to 15% of his AD. This was in exchange for percentage maximum health damage, once for the base Q and once again for the empowered Q, for a potential spam of 6% of target's maximum health as bonus mixed damage. This was met with outrage from the entire Skarner player base. Me. And my outrage was loud enough for them to give back 5% AD to the Q. I'm joking. It's not just me. These changes cemented Riot's perspective on Skarner as a tank rather than a Juggernaut. Though the latter class would scale greatly with AD, tanks would not. Sometimes having percentage damage like a Mumu does, but rarely having consistent, high ratios for low cooldown abilities. This made Skarner a tanky tank shredder, but wouldn't synergy as well with raw AD. He could still spam out Trinity Force, and he would still scale against most champions that weren't going glass cannon themselves. But from here, there were mostly only minor changes to Skarner, who has journeyed from a hybrid fighter with permaslow, to a rapid pursuer with venomous stuns, to a spire-tethered Juggernaut, forgotten by most, and the last of his kind. Perhaps wiped out by one major change and the extinction of the Breckern. On patch 14.7, Skarner was met with a full rework and relaunch, but it isn't all doom and gloom. Though the Skarners are night and day by appearance and by gameplay identity at a glance, there were some interesting turnouts with the early days of the rework. Clearly in Riot's vision, Skarner would be reworked to be a tank, which was unnerving at the time for sure, but at some point during his PBE cycles, someone added a glimmer of hope to Skarner's new Q, an AD ratio. I believe initially on PBE this was a 70% AD ratio, which was quite insane and very satisfying to use, but it arrived on live servers as a 40% bonus AD ratio, not boosting its health scaling, neither with his own nor his opponents, but instead increased it by a flat amount. But this is only one in an onslaught of utterly morphed abilities and statistics. What remained of old Skarner, if anything, and if they did, where were they in modern Skarner's kit, and from which Skarner did they come from? First off, Skarner's reworked kit has multiple ways to apply a target's maximum health as damage, both on his passive as magic damage and on his boulder throw as physical damage. This tank shredding property is straight from his most recent incarnation of Juggernaut Skarner, after his Crystal / AD ratio was exchanged for percentage health damage. The linear skillshot nature of his third Q or second cast of Q, as well as its ability to slow from distance, are much like Skarner's old Fracture once it was given a slow from his first version's Q. Tossing a skill shot to slow a distant target in order to close the gap is something I've been doing on Skarner for the majority of my time playing him, both on Crystal Skarner and Rock Skarner. Speaking of the slow on Skarner's old Crystal Slash, his current W releases a shockwave like a massive version of Skarner's old slowing Q, providing a slow and once again from a distance. Of course, it's also providing a on-demand max HP shield, just like Juggernaut Skarner's W had done. Skarner's entirely new ability, Ixtal's Impact on his E, charges at enemies even through terrain to grab, suppress and stun them. Where on earth did this come from? Well, it's mostly to try and help Skarner's old issue of not being able to reach melee range of any opponent due to being entirely stopped by a single slow or stun, and even with it being new and designed for that purpose, it fulfills a similar goal Skarner players would have had before. The common Skarner goal of attempting to lock onto and charge towards one enemy target to suppress them and impale them. No, you won't be charging around at the speed of sound. It does go quite fast, ignores slows, and can ignore terrain for unique angles. However, it can be body blocked by other enemy champions who dive in the way to take the hit. It won't be stealing away carries quite as easily as before, but maybe the ability shouldn't. Looking at it this way, this puts the rework on a similar level to Warwick's rework, which was considered universally good, changing his ultimate from a disgusting point-and-click suppression to a linear dash that suppresses the first target it collides with. But there's more to Skarner than just his ultimate, no matter what the pro builds ever looked like. Skarner's old Q was spammable. It had a very low cooldown and could reduce its cooldown through auto-attacking. New Skarner has high cooldowns, so am I really playing Skarner if I'm not breaking my Q key every game? Skarner's new Q is more similar to his old Q than you might think. When you pick up a rock with new Skarner, your next 3 attacks become empowered, with AoE, bonus damage, and even attack speed. Sound familiar? It's only for the next 3 attacks, unlike the near permanent feeling boost of Skarner's empowered Crystal Slash, but every attack you do with your Q active is like a cast of his old Q, the first 2 strikes being normal, and the third Boulder Smash taking the place of the empowered strike. Not only that, but because Skarner's Q begins its cooldown from when you pick up the rock, this means that with advanced planning, lowering its cooldown through items, it means you are able to spam Qs very often, and have almost permanent uptime on Skarner's Q. You're not pressing Q nearly as often as before, but you are still doing AoE strikes around yourself practically as often. I loved old Skarner. I wouldn't say this lightly. You can still spam Qs on Reworked Skarner. It isn't meta, as everyone chooses to build full tank, but if you choose to build high ability haste, such as Spear's Shojin for example, you can really spam out those AoE empowered attacks with Q very often, and can get it near permanent with a couple of other haste items like Lucidity Boots and Black Cleaver. So in a way, just like how a classic Juggernaut chooses between AD and tank items as they want, Skarner can still do that. Most of this is owed to the addition of that AD ratio on his Q. Whoever decided to not let Skarner release on live servers with no AD ratio on his Q, I love you. With this being spammable, you can even leverage Trinity Force or similar Sheen items if you so wanted, but I digress. The final thing is his ultimate, Impale. Instead of ulting one targeted enemy, it is now a skill shot. Though you may lament at it no longer being as easy to use, changing powerful abilities to skill shots has historically often been a good change, just like Warwick's rework with his ultimate. Not always, but luckily there's a trade-off of giving it a cast time, yes, but now also giving it the ability to stun 3 people. That actually makes more sense not only for Skarner as a team fighting tank, but also with his area of effect fighting nature. That said, it's not all purely amazing. Though aspects of old Skarner's kit live on as I've tried to outline, some parts are simply not there. If Crystal Spire mechanics were something you enjoyed, they are now entirely gone. Personally, though I learned to like them since the Juggernaut update, they were never something I was quite enthralled by. While new Skarner can dash at opponents with an honestly overpowered ability, he no longer feels like a fast Scorpion you struggle to get rid of, because now he is anything but fast. There's a delay when you pick up a rock, there's a delay when you throw a rock, there's a delay when you cast Impale, your E's charge starts off slow no matter what your movement speed is. I'm pretty sure PBE Skarner's W also had a delay, unlike old Skarner, who only had immobile cast times on his E and R cast, which were oh so very brief. Luckily, the Skarner Q cast time of picking up a rock was reduced, but even so, there aren't any movement speed boosts, zones, or anything like that. This is a slow, lumbering tank. And 1 AD ratio, as much as I appreciate it, does not make him a Juggernaut, and nor did Riot ever intend him to be one. Skarner's base AD went from 141.5 at level 18 pre-rework to only 114 at level 18 on time of writing patch 25.06. Base stats were a big part of what made Juggernaut so strong, and his lack of them made him feel so much weaker in many ways. I think it's unfair to say this rework was faithful, but not even Riot would say that, as from the beginning they made it clear they wanted to tear Skarner down and build his rework from the ground up. But on the opposite end, I'd be hesitant to say it wasn't faithful at all. Though Riot's description may sound like a brutal rework, so much of old Skarner does remain. He's not a funny hyper-carry Juggernaut to me anymore. If anything, he doesn't have too much in common with Juggernaut Skarner, and honestly, has more in common with the previous incarnations of Skarner. With permanent slow potential on his Q with certain items and chaining with his W, an onslaught of crowd controls, and the aim to pick and target one unlucky foe and their 2 closest friends. While new Skarner does away with the entire aesthetic and lore of old Skarner, this complete VGU inherited more than I could have ever guessed it would, surpassing expectations that were set abysmally low by reworks past. Modernizations were needed to combat the evolving levels of crowd control and damage present in modern League of Legends, even at the sacrifice of aspects of his identity. Few champions have had as many reworks as Skarner, back and forth with wildly varying ideas. But to tie them all together somewhat in a new overhaul? I see the wisdom in that. Though my opinion on new Skarner may be mixed, with a hint of positivity, I'd like to hear what opinion you have on this particularly controversial overhaul. Do you prefer the new aesthetic or the old Crystal Scorpion? Do you like his new kit? And could you see yourself trying an ability haste build on the Reworked Skarner to try and live out the good old days? Leave your answer in a comment below. This is a long overdue return to an old series before the rework, and I hope you like what I've done with the format. If you're hoping for videos on other champions, they may be old, but I've already done quite a few, which I'll link for you in the end screen. I do play Skarner, a heck lot of Thresh, as well as other games on my Twitch channel, linked in the description below, and I'd love to see you drop by. Videos like this are possible because of lovely members like these, who I'll take a moment to thank. Members receive early access to my videos as well as a special shout out, and so, shoutouts to the members War Squid, Ultimate Ground, Cryo's Dad, Gentleman Zeta, Lunar Eagle 1996, 53rd Alabama Booty Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mr. Noodle, Bass1378, Gilbert Morals, Tiemann Caranfil, Luxius, Dario Castro, Overseer, and Luca, Colorado Cosmico, Hollowed, Luna Arc, Cposh, KORC22, Torjiro, Senyo Scrim, Zanata Wright, El Pedro Kotal, Victor Katak, HGBeat91, Sir Gaming Brain, Lexivix, Quasho, Blindness, Boomborn, Jacob Frisbee, Goku Gonza, Logan James, Young067, Briefcase Cat, Nirabi, T90, and Patricio Garita. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel, and I'll see you next time.